The Grand Council chamber drifted through the endless void like a radiant gem set among the stars. Within its vast interior, envoys from 47 distinct species had gathered for what all understood would be a meeting of immense consequence. The atmosphere buzzed with unease and anticipation as delegates settled into their circular seats, a design meant to symbolize equality among all races. Commander Zithra stood at the central podium, her crystalline skin gleaming under the soft cerulean light as she surveyed the crowd before her. A Vulcan by birth, her people had served as peacekeepers of the Galactic Council for 3 generations. But today, she bore news that would shake the foundations of every world represented there. With a motion of her hand, she activated the holographic display. The projection revealed a distant sector on the galactic rim, red markers spreading across it like droplets of blood on untouched fabric. Each one signified a fallen system. "The Kreeler swarm has breached our outer defenses," she announced, her clear voice carrying effortlessly to every corner of the chamber. 12 systems have fallen in the last 3 weeks. Intelligence reports indicate their course leads toward the core worlds. If we cannot halt them now, the Cerulean homeworld will be next. A murmur swept through the chamber. The Krill were no strangers to the galaxy. Every civilization old enough to keep records knew their name. They were a recurring horror, returning every few centuries like a cosmic plague. The swarm devoured everything, leaving behind lifeless worlds stripped of all organic matter. Ambassador Felnix rose from his seat, his tall, slender cerulean frame shimmering with hues that shifted between blue and green. Now his skin pulsed with a deep purple, an unmistakable sign of fear. "How many ships do they possess?" he demanded. "Our scouts estimate at least 1,500 vessels," Zithra replied gravely. "Possibly more. They're concealing their numbers within the Dendera asteroid fields." The chamber erupted into chaos. 1,500 ships was not an invasion. It was annihilation waiting to happen. "We must rally the combined fleet at once," Zethra shouted above the rising clamor. "Every member world must contribute whatever forces they can. We must meet the swarm at Dendara and hold the line there." Council leader Morvan stood, his movements slow and deliberate. The ancient Theorion, more than 2 centuries old, had witnessed 3 Krelor incursions before this one. Silver hair cascaded past his shoulders, and his eyes carried the weight of ages. "Commander Zathra speaks with wisdom," he said, his calm voice silencing the uproar. "The fleet must deploy within 48 hours. But we must also consider every available resource." He paused, gaze sweeping the assembly. "What of our newest allies? Should we not seek assistance from the humans?" The silence that followed was heavy, not born of fear, but of uncertainty tinged with something else. Apprehension. Zethra's crystal features tightened. She had anticipated this question and dreaded it. Humanity had joined the Galactic Council only 15 cycles ago, still inexperienced, still learning, but their reputation had already become legendary. "The humans dispatched 3 frigates to assist against the Drower raiders," she said carefully. "Their performance was sufficient for that mission. But this is another matter entirely. This demands capital ships, vessels capable of enduring sustained warfare against overwhelming odds." Another hologram flickered to life beside her, a human warship. Massive, angular, and battle-scarred, it looked like it had survived a dozen wars. Weapons bristled from every surface, and along the bow gleamed a name that commanded silence. Read, UN's Virginia. "I have reviewed the classified intelligence on human capital ships," Zithra continued. "These vessels are not designed for surgical strikes. They are engineered for absolute devastation. Humans do not wage war the way we do. They do not prize finesse or delicate maneuvers. They apply overwhelming force until the threat simply ceases to exist. But they are our allies," Felnix objected. "Allies with consequences," Zithra replied. "Their battleships carry armaments we outlawed centuries ago. Nuclear payloads, kinetic bombardment arrays, plasma lances meant to melt heavy armor. When humans go to war, they rarely aim merely to defeat. They aim to erase." Morvan stroked his long beard thoughtfully. "You speak as if you fear our allies, Commander." "I do not fear them," Zithra answered, meeting his gaze steadily. "I respect them. Precisely because of that respect, I fear what their good intentions might unleash. Humans have not mastered restraint. They have not learned when a victory costs too much. If we invite their capital ships into this battle, we might win. And we might also rain destruction on a scale that will horrify every civilization in this chamber. A Nexian delegate rose, Corin, logical and measured. What proof do you offer that human weapons would create unacceptable collateral damage? He asked. Zithra altered the hologram. Combat footage filled the air, a human training drill. 3 human battleships engaged simulated foes. Missiles launched in volleys by the hundreds. Railguns spat projectiles at speeds most species could not track. The mock enemy fleet was methodically annihilated in under 8 minutes. This was practice, Zithra said softly, on empty ranges against simulated targets. Now imagine that scale of firepower in a contested zone with allied fleets nearby. Imagine coordinating with ships that consider multi-megaton detonations a routine tactical option. Silence sank over the chamber. Several delegates shifted in their seats. I propose we handle this threat ourselves, Zithra pressed on. The combined fleet fields 500 warships drawn from across the galaxy. We have faced the Krier before and understand their methods. We can hold them at Dendara and push them back without resorting to the kind of total warfare humans practice. Morvan glanced about the room. Very well. We will vote. All in favor of requesting human capital ship assistance? Fewer than a quarter of the delegates raised hands, tentacles, or whatever their species used to signal assent. The motion fails, Morvan declared. Commander Zithra, you will lead the combined fleet against the Krior swarm. We will formally request from Earth only medical vessels and escort frigates. Their battleships will remain in port. Zithra inclined her head in acknowledgement. The choice was made. The galaxy would confront the Krior by its own methods. She forced herself to believe it was the right call, even as a small, persistent doubt whispered at the edge of her thoughts. 40 light-years from the Council. Aboard Earth, Admiral Curtis Blake sat in the Unified Nations Naval Command. The Council's message blinked on his screen. He read it twice to be sure. Captain Linda Hayes entered without knocking. Formality long ago yielding to friendship after 15 years of service together. You saw the message? He asked without looking up. They want medships and escorts. No heavy combatants, Linda replied. Curtis stared at the tactical map. The Kreeler markers crawling inward, updated in near real time by long-range arrays. The swarm tracked toward the core worlds, just as the Council predicted. The combined fleet would make a stand at Dendara, the largest engagement in 50 years. They don't want our battleships, he said quietly. Can you blame them? Linda asked. We frighten them. Hell, we frighten me sometimes. Curtis managed a tight smile, but there was no humor in it. Prep the UNS Mercy and her escort group. Medical configuration. Full trauma teams. We'll honor their request. And the third fleet? Linda asked. He watched the enemy markers, thinking of 500 Allied ships facing 1,500 swarm vessels. The odds were grim. Run readiness drills, he said at last. Full combat scenarios, heavy engagement protocols, use the Krior as the opposing force. Linda raised an eyebrow. You think they'll change their minds? Curtis looked to his second in command. I don't expect negotiation. I don't expect the swarm to stop. I expect the combined fleet to learn the difference between fighting a war and surviving one. When they do, I want us ready to help. And if they still refuse... Decision, Curtis said firmly. But Linda, make sure every battleship in the Third Fleet is ready to jump on 12 hours' notice. Every weapon system loaded, calibrated, and locked. Every crew member at their post. You really think it'll come to that? She asked quietly. Curtis brought up archival footage from the last major Krior incursion, 70 years past. 3 civilizations had been erased before the swarm was finally halted, and the price of victory had been almost unbearable. I hope not, he murmured. But hope isn't a strategy. Preparation is. The Dendara system floated like a silent snare, waiting to spring. 500 warships from across the galaxy formed a vast defensive grid stretching millions of kilometers wide. Each vessel held its exact position with machine-like precision as shields shimmered to life and weapon banks powered up in synchronized rhythm. The combined fleet represented the finest military strength of 47 civilizations. Every hull gleaming, every crew braced. On the bridge of the flagship Eternal Resolve, Commander Zathra studied the tactical overlays with calm discipline. Her crystalline features reflected the shifting tactical lights as her crew moved swiftly through final checks. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. The fleet was ready, at least as ready as anyone could be for what was coming. Far behind the battle line, distant from the primary engagement zone, drifted a single human vessel, the UNS Mercy. Its hull gleamed white and red, the universal human markings of a hospital ship. 6 corvettes circled protectively around her like loyal sentinels. Zathra had deliberately stationed them at the rear, close enough to receive casualties, far enough to stay out of the firestorm to come. "Cryor signatures detected," her tactical officer announced sharply. "Multiple swarm clusters approaching from Vector 773. Zithra's breath caught as the holomap updated. Hundreds of red blips appeared, then multiplied into thousands. The Kreeler swarm burst from hyperspace like a plague made flesh. Their ships were grotesque living constructs, pulsing with a diseased bioluminescent glow. They moved with flawless, predatory coordination, guided by a hive consciousness older than any single species in the room. "All ships, prepare for engagement," Zthra commanded, forcing steadiness into her voice as icy dread crawled up her spine. "Hold the line. Make every shot count." The Kreeler advanced without a word. No demands, no threats, no hesitation. They simply came forward like an ocean of death, intent on consuming all in their path. The void lit up as the first wave entered firing range. The combined fleet unleashed a synchronized barrage, plasma beams and particle cannons tearing through the dark. The leading edge of the swarm shuddered under the assault. Several vessels exploded in blooms of fire. Others cracked apart as their organic hulls ruptured. But for every ship destroyed, 3 more surged through the wreckage, relentless and unstoppable. The swarm flowed around the bombardment like water around stone, cold, endless, fearless. Aboard the UNS Mercy, Dr. Paul Green stood in the main, treatment bay, watching the unfolding battle through the live tactical feed. He was a civilian physician, a volunteer who had believed this deployment would be a routine support mission. Now, as the screen filled with devastation, he realized how deeply he'd misjudged the scale of the war he'd stepped into. "Decision," Curtis said, his voice steady but low. "But Linda, see that every battleship in the 3rd Fleet is ready to jump within 12 hours. Full combat readiness, weapons loaded, calibrated, every crew member at their post." Linda hesitated. "You really think it'll come to that, Curtis?" Pulled up ancient footage from the last major Cryor incursion, 70 years gone. 3 entire civilizations had fallen before the swarm was stopped, and even then, the cost had been beyond reckoning. "I hope not," he said softly. "But hope isn't a strategy. Preparation is." The Dendara system waited like a sprung trap in the void. 500 warships from across the galaxy held formation in a lattice that stretched millions of kilometers wide. Each vessel hovered in flawless alignment, shields thrumming, weapons hot. It was the finest coalition fleet ever assembled, 47 civilizations united in purpose and fear. On the Eternal Resolve, Commander Zithra stood at the center of her bridge, eyes locked on the shifting tactical map. Her crew moved with quiet urgency, executing final checks. The fleet was ready, every weapon primed, every soul braced. And yet, the silence before the storm felt unbearable. At the rear of the formation, far from the expected battlefront, floated the human hospital ship UNS Mercy. Its white and red hull glimmered faintly against the starlight, encircled by 6 escorting corvettes. Zithra had placed them there intentionally, close. Enough to render aid far enough to stay clear of the inferno. Receiving first casualties, Amy said as alarms flared across her console. Vulcan cruiser steadfast, multiple plasma burns, decompression trauma. Bring them in, Dr. Paul Green ordered. Triage in Bay 3, prep all surgical teams. Shuttles began to arrive, offloading the wounded in waves. Paul moved swiftly from bed to bed, issuing commands and stabilizing where he could. But even as he worked, his eyes flicked toward the wall display, and what he saw made his stomach twist. The Kreeler were changing tactics. Instead of dispersing, the swarm was now focusing massive numbers of ships against isolated targets, burying each vessel under sheer force before moving to the next. It was brutal, efficient, unstoppable. 6 hours into the battle, the first Allied warship fell. A cerulean destroyer named Brighter vanished in a burst of reactor fire. 3 more followed in rapid succession. Paul opened a comm link to the bridge. Captain Morris, you need to see this casualty pattern. The fleet's losing structure. Ships are being isolated and picked off. I'm already aware, Captain Dennis Morris replied grimly. He had been in constant contact with Admiral Curtis Blake back on Earth. The situation was unraveling faster than any projection. Dr. Green, prep emergency evacuation protocols. We may need to withdraw at a moment's notice. What about the wounded still in surgery? That's why I said prepare, not execute, Morris replied. But this is getting bad. Really bad. On the bridge of the Eternal Resolve, Commander Zathra reached the same conclusion. The fleet had destroyed roughly 300 enemy vessels, but over 2,000 remained. Worse, the Cryor were adapting with terrifying speed. Energy, weapons that had been effective in the first hour, were now countered completely. Commander, we have to fall back to the secondary line, her first officer urged. We can't hold this position. Zithra stared at the tactical display. If we retreat, the Cryor will have a clear path to the Cerulean homeworld. 20 billion civilians. If we stay, we'll be annihilated, her officer said quietly. At least if we fall back, we can fight again. He was right. Pride would not save them. Only reinforcements, or a miracle, could. Transmit an emergency request to the Galactic Council, Zethra ordered. We need immediate reinforcements, heavy combat vessels, whatever they can send. The Council will demand justification for the request, her comms officer reminded her. Zethra's eyes lingered on the display, on the dying ships, on the medical frigates behind the line, on the memory of the human battleships she had once feared. 20 billion lives depended on her next words. Then tell them, she said, each syllable burning like broken glass. We formally request human capital ship assistance, all available heavy combat vessels, immediate deployment. The transmission raced across the stars, through quantum channels, reaching Earth in mere seconds. At Unified Nations Naval Command, Admiral Curtis Blake read the message 3 times. He had known this day would come, but seeing the plea in writing still hit him like a weight. Linda, he called, get in here. Captain Linda Hayes entered, eyes already scanning her datapad. Her expression was grim. Recall the 3rd Fleet from exercises, Curtis ordered. Combat loadout. I want every ship ready to jump in 2 hours. All of them, Linda asked. Even the battleships? All of them, Curtis confirmed. 23 battleships, 48 heavy cruisers, every destroyer and frigate that can keep formation. We go in heavy. Rules of engagement? She asked. Curtis's jaw tightened. He thought of the Cryor, the species that never surrendered, never spoke, never stopped. He thought of the 500 Allied ships dying alone in the dark. Weapons free, he said at last. The Kreeler don't take prisoners. Neither do we. Linda nodded and turned to leave, but Curtis's voice stopped her. One more thing, he said. Tell Captain Tony Bradford of the Virginia to review the old Proxima Doctrine. Linda froze. Sir, that doctrine was declared excessive by every review board. I know, Curtis replied quietly, but the Cryor won't be swayed by restraint. They'll keep coming until we end them. Bradford knows what that means." "Understood, sir," she said, and left to carry out the order. Curtis sat alone, staring at the tactical map. The Third Fleet, humanity's hammer, 23 battleships built for wars that couldn't be won any other way. He thought of Zithra's doomed fleet, of the billions of civilians depending on their stand, and of what would happen when humanity entered the fight. "Human battleships," the officer repeated, his voice trembling. 23 confirmed capital-class vessels with over 70 escorts. "They're jumping in right on our flank." For a heartbeat, the bridge of the Eternal Resolve went silent. Then the comms erupted with excited voices. Hope, something Zethra had not felt in hours, flared within her chest. "Signal the fleet," she ordered sharply. "Tell them the humans are here." Across the Dendara system, the combined fleet's surviving ships received the message. For the first time since the battle began, their comm channels filled with shouts of disbelief and renewed determination. At that same moment, space itself rippled and tore open near the edge of the system. The darkness exploded with light as the UNS Virginia led the Third Fleet. Out of hyperspace in perfect formation, each human battleship was a moving fortress, 5 kilometers of dark alloy armor and weapon ports, glowing with restrained power. Rail cannons lined their flanks like silent gods of war. On the bridge of the Virginia, Captain Tony Bradford surveyed the tactical display. The chaos of the battle stretched before him, a maelstrom of fire and wreckage where hundreds of ships were dying every minute. "All ships, weapons hot," he said, voice steady, calm. "Target the leading edge of the swarm. Fire for effect." Moments later, the void erupted. Dozens of nuclear warheads streaked into the swarm, their trajectories precise to the millisecond. The cryor vessels reacted too late. Space turned white. Shock waves rippled through the void as 200 megaton detonations carved glowing scars across the darkness. When the light faded, an entire segment of the swarm was simply gone. "Holy hell," whispered Lieutenant Nash. That's a graveyard." Tony didn't answer. His eyes were still on the display, watching as the swarm struggled to reorganize. "Reload," he ordered. "Fire the kinetic penetrators. Let's remind them what mass at relativistic velocity looks like." Tungsten rods, each weighing several tons, launched at near-light speed. The impacts shattered more cryor vessels than any plasma barrage could have. Zithra watched in stunned silence as the humans advanced, their formation cutting into the swarm like a scythe through grass. No hesitation. No retreat. Every salvo was deliberate, devastating, final. For the first time since the battle began, the cryor faltered. The Eternal Resolve's bridge crew stared at the unfolding carnage. One of them whispered, "They're monsters." Sthra shook her head slowly. "No," she said quietly. "They're human." Across the system, the Third Fleet continued its grim advance. Battleships fired in synchronized waves. Nuclear fire bloomed again and again until even the stars seemed to burn. When the last cryor vessel finally broke apart, the silence that followed was deafening. The swarm was gone, exterminated with a precision and brutality the galaxy had not witnessed in millennia. On the bridge of the Virginia, Tony Bradford finally exhaled. "Status?" "Minimal damage, Captain," Lisa reported. "The swarm's gone. All of it." Tony nodded once. "Then send a signal to the combined fleet. Tell them Dendara is secure." In orbit above the devastated battlefield, the message spread. Across every surviving alien ship, crews stared at the human fleet in awe and fear. The galaxy had been saved, but at a terrible cost. And as Admiral Curtis Blake later said in his report,